The first thing I noticed wasn't the broken glass, it was the silence. My greenhouse had always been alive, humming with fans, dripping irrigation lines, bees wandering in through the vents. But that Monday afternoon, after driving home from a quiet weekend visiting my oldest daughter, there wasn't a sound except gravel crunching beneath my truck tires. I remember easing off the gas because something felt wrong before I even understood what I was looking at. Then I saw it. Or more accurately, I realized I couldn't see it anymore. 15 years of work had simply vanished. Where my greenhouse had stood, there was nothing but twisted steel, shattered panes sparkling across the dirt like ice, and piles of crushed tomato vines mixed with broken irrigation pipes. I just sat there behind the steering wheel with both hands gripping it so hard my knuckles turned white, because my brain refused to accept what my eyes were telling me. My wife, Emily, and I had built that greenhouse ourselves after she beat breast cancer. She always joked that if life gave you another chance, you ought to spend it growing something worth leaving behind. Every beam had a story. Every row of herbs reminded me of weekends with the kids when they were still young enough to argue over who got to water the peppers. After Emily passed away 4 years earlier, I couldn't bring myself to change a thing inside that building. I still kept her old wooden stool beside the seed table, still reached for the coffee mug she'd painted with little sunflowers even though the handle had been glued back together twice. That greenhouse wasn't just another farm building. It was the last place that still felt like home. I climbed out of the truck and walked through the wreckage in complete disbelief, careful not to step on the broken glass, although there wasn't much left worth protecting anymore. My boot nudged a crushed tray of seedlings I'd started only 2 weeks before, and I found myself kneeling down without even thinking, brushing dirt off leaves that were already dead. That's when I spotted the bright yellow paper flapping from a bent support beam. It read, "Removed due to community environmental compliance violations. Unauthorized agricultural structure causing visual disturbance." I actually laughed, just one short bitter laugh, because it was so ridiculous it barely deserved anger. Unauthorized? The greenhouse sat nearly 400 yards inside my own property line. My farm covered 140 acres, and the luxury subdivision next door had been built almost 20 years after my family bought this land. They didn't own a single inch of what they had destroyed. I walked back toward the house, pulled my property survey from the office cabinet, spread it across the kitchen table, and stared at the map just to make sure I wasn't somehow losing my mind. Nope, the greenhouse wasn't even close to the boundary. Then my neighbor, Walt, rolled into the driveway on his old ATV. He took one look at my face and didn't even bother asking what happened. "They finally crossed the line, didn't they?" he said quietly. I nodded toward the pile of twisted steel. Walt removed his hat, scratched the back of his head, and muttered, "Saw 3 bulldozers over here Saturday morning. Figured you hired contractors." "No," I answered. "Looks like somebody else hired them." He looked sick. "You gonna call the sheriff?" "Eventually." I kept staring out the kitchen window. First, I need to understand why they thought they could get away with this. The answer arrived less than an hour later when I called the office of Cedar Ridge Estates and asked to speak with their HOA manager. The receptionist nervously transferred me to the board president, a man named Preston Hale. I'd only met him twice before. Both times he'd complained about sunlight reflecting off my greenhouse into the back patios of a few million-dollar homes during certain evenings in spring. I figured he was exaggerating. Turns out he wasn't exaggerating. He just believed that made it my problem. Preston didn't even sound apologetic. "Mr. Carter," he said, calm as could be, "our architectural committee determined the structure negatively impacted neighborhood aesthetics." I blinked. "You demolished my building." It was creating repeated complaints. "On land you don't own." There was a long pause before he answered. "Our contractors informed us the property boundary was unclear." I looked at the framed survey hanging on my office wall and almost smiled. "Funny," I said. "It's crystal clear from where I'm standing." He sighed like I was wasting his afternoon. "Perhaps we can discuss compensation once everyone calms down." Compensation? That word echoed in my head long after he hung up. He thought this was about money. He thought he could write a check and erase 15 years of memories. What Preston didn't know was that the greenhouse happened to sit beside the original irrigation control station my grandfather built decades before Cedar Ridge ever existed, the same pumping system that still supplied water through a legal easement to every decorative fountain, artificial pond, and golf course lake inside that expensive little neighborhood. Most people saw a greenhouse. I saw the heart of an entire water network, and every valve on that system sat behind a locked door on my property. I looked out across the ruined glass one more time, took a slow breath, grabbed the old brass key hanging beside the back door, and started walking toward the pump house. The walk from the house to the pump station usually took me about 6 minutes, but that afternoon it felt longer because every few steps I'd catch myself looking back toward the pile of twisted steel where Emily's greenhouse used to stand. The late afternoon sun hit the broken glass just right, making it sparkle like nothing had happened, and for one strange second I imagined I'd open the greenhouse door, hear the old fan rattling in the corner, and find Emily humming while trimming basil. Grief does funny things to your mind. It lets you believe impossible things for a heartbeat before reality catches up again. By the time I reached the small concrete building sitting beneath a line of old cottonwoods, that feeling had disappeared, replaced by something colder. I unlocked the heavy steel door and stepped inside. The familiar smell of machine oil and damp concrete wrapped around me. 3 pumps hummed steadily, pressure gauges sat exactly where they always had, and hundreds of gallons of water moved through pipes buried beneath both my ranch and the neighboring subdivision. My grandfather installed the first version of this system nearly 50 years ago when most of this valley was still cattle country. Years later, when developers bought the neighboring land to build Cedar Ridge estates, they discovered drilling enough new wells would cost a fortune. Instead, they negotiated an easement with my father. The agreement was simple. They could purchase water delivered through my infrastructure, but ownership of every pump, valve, control panel, and maintenance building remained with my family forever. We handled repairs. They paid monthly fees. It had worked just fine for 2 decades because every previous HOA board understood one simple rule: don't start fights with the man who controls the water. Apparently, Preston Hale never bothered reading that part of the history. I stood in front of the master control wheel for several seconds. I wasn't trying to punish innocent homeowners. Most of them probably had no idea what their board had done. But there was another truth that kept echoing through my head. If someone can destroy your property without consequences once, they'll do it again. I slowly turned the first valve until the pressure dropped. Then the second. Finally, I switched the decorative water supply into emergency maintenance mode, exactly as allowed under the service agreement whenever equipment required inspection following damage to nearby infrastructure. There wasn't a single illegal thing about what I was doing. The greenhouse debris had crushed several exposed control conduits leading into the station. Before restoring full pressure, I had every legal right to inspect the system for safety. I locked the building again, slipped the key into my pocket, and headed back toward the house. About 3 hours later, my phone rang. It was Walt. "You watching this?" he asked, laughing. I turned on the porch television connected to the security cameras overlooking the ridge. Even from nearly half a mile away, I could see one of Cedar Ridge's entrance fountains barely dribbling water. By sunset, it had stopped completely. The next morning, things became much more interesting. My routine never changed. Coffee before sunrise, feed the horses, check fences, then make a slow lap around the property in my old pickup. As I drove past the ridge overlooking Cedar Ridge Estates, I noticed maintenance crews gathered around the largest pond. 2 boats floated near the center, while workers poked long poles into the muddy bottom, obviously searching for a blockage they weren't going to find. Around noon, I received 3 separate voicemails from the HOA office requesting an emergency meeting. I ignored every one of them. Instead, I drove into town and met with my attorney, Rebecca Collins. Rebecca had represented my family for nearly 15 years and understood agricultural property law better than anyone in the county. I placed photographs of the destroyed greenhouse across her conference table. She studied each one without speaking. "Do they have any claim to this land?" she finally asked. "Not even close." I handed her certified surveys, tax maps, drone images, and copies of the original deed. She looked up over her glasses. "Then they have a serious problem." We spent the next 3 hours documenting everything. Replacement costs, lost crops, business records from local restaurants that bought herbs from me every week, community food bank donations interrupted by the destruction, security camera footage showing bulldozers entering through my North Service Road. Even better, one of the cameras clearly captured the company logo painted on the side of the excavator. Rebecca smiled for the first time all afternoon. "They hired professionals," she said. "Professionals leave paperwork." By the time I returned home, the sheriff's deputy was waiting in my driveway. Deputy Luis Moreno had known my family since I was a teenager. He walked through the wreckage, took photographs, measured tire tracks, and carefully removed the yellow HOA notice from the broken beam. "This wasn't vandalism," he said quietly. "This looks organized. That's what worries me." He nodded. "We'll be requesting contracts from both the contractor and the HOA board." Around sunset, my cell phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't Preston. It was the landscaping company responsible for maintaining Cedar Ridge's golf course. The superintendent sounded exhausted. "Mr. Carter, we're trying to determine when water service will resume. The system is under safety inspection after nearby structural damage," I replied. "You'll need to discuss the cause of that damage with your HOA." He was silent for a moment before answering. "Understood." That told me everything I needed to know. Word was spreading. Day 2 arrived with temperatures climbing past 95 degrees. Without constant irrigation, the subdivision began changing faster than most people would believe. Expensive Kentucky bluegrass started fading from deep green to pale yellow. Flower beds wilted. Decorative waterfalls became silent walls of dry stone. Homeowners gathered beside empty ponds taking pictures with their phones while children stared at cracked mud where ducks had floated only days earlier. Nature doesn't care how expensive your house is. Grass dies at the same speed for millionaires as it does for everybody else. That afternoon, the wind picked up across the valley. Normally, the damp soil around the ponds kept loose dust under control, but now dry earth lifted into the air and drifted through the neighborhood in long brown clouds. Security footage from my hilltop cameras showed luxury SUVs leaving trails of dust behind them like old ranch trucks crossing desert roads. Then came the phone call I'd been expecting. Preston Hale didn't bother with greetings. "This has gone far enough." "Has it?" I asked. "Turn the pumps back on." "The pumps are available as soon as my damaged infrastructure is certified safe." "Don't play games." I leaned back in my porch chair. "You sent bulldozers onto private property. Our attorney says the boundary confusion changes liability." I couldn't help laughing. "Preston, your contractor drove past 3 fences, 2 posted property signs, and a gate with my family name welded across it. That's one impressive misunderstanding." His voice hardened. "You're costing homeowners thousands." "No," I answered calmly. "Your decision is costing them thousands." He lowered his voice, trying a different approach. "Let's settle this privately. Were you planning to rebuild my wife's greenhouse privately before or after you knocked it down?" Silence. Long enough for both of us to hear the wind whistling across the phone. Finally, he muttered, "We'll be in touch." "I'm sure you will." The call ended. I looked toward the ridge where another cloud of dust rolled across Cedar Ridge's entrance boulevard. For the first time since finding the wreckage, I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt patient, because pressure has a way of revealing exactly who people really are, and judging by what was happening over there, the real panic hadn't even started yet. By the 4th morning, the situation inside Cedar Ridge had turned from an inconvenience into full-blown chaos. Dust coated everything. White fences had turned tan, luxury cars looked like they'd been parked on a construction site for weeks, and homeowners were posting photos all over local community pages asking why they were paying premium HOA dues to live in what looked like the edge of the Mojave. The subdivision's resort canceled 2 outdoor weddings because fountains had stopped flowing and the landscaping looked half dead. Realtors quietly pulled open house events, knowing nobody wanted to spend $1 million on a home surrounded by brown grass and empty ponds. Then the television news showed up. Not because I had called them looking for revenge, but because stories like this tend to find their own audience. One helicopter shot showed my untouched green ranch sitting beside an expensive neighborhood covered in drifting dust, and the contrast spoke louder than any interview ever could. Later that afternoon, Rebecca called me. "They're ready," she said. "Not to negotiate, to surrender." 20 minutes later, I walked into a conference room at the county courthouse. Sitting across the table were Preston Hale, 2 nervous board members, their attorney, representatives from the contractor, and an insurance adjuster who looked like he wished he'd taken the day off. Nobody started with small talk. Preston looked 10 years older than he had just a week earlier. "Mr. Carter," he began, "the board is prepared to finance construction of a replacement greenhouse." I folded my hands on the table. One greenhouse doesn't replace 15 years. Their attorney slid a folder toward me. We're also prepared to compensate you for documented crop losses. I didn't even open it. Rebecca did all the talking after that. She presented photographs, financial records, engineering reports, and the sheriff's preliminary findings, then calmly outlined what a civil trial could cost everyone involved if the case moved forward. By the time she finished, nobody across the table looked particularly confident anymore. Finally, I spoke. Here are my terms. You rebuild the greenhouse at twice its original size using commercial-grade materials. You pay for every crop destroyed, every week of lost production, every legal expense, and every piece of irrigation equipment that was damaged. You issue a written public apology acknowledging the structure was on private property. And I paused long enough for every eye in the room to meet mine. We rewrite the water agreement. From this day forward, Cedar Ridge pays a monthly infrastructure management fee adjusted annually, recognizing that every pump, valve, and control station remains my property. If those terms aren't acceptable, we'll let 12 jurors decide instead. Nobody answered immediately. They didn't need to. I could already see it on their faces. They knew the fight was over. Contracts were signed 3 days later, but I still didn't unlock the pump station. Preston couldn't hide his frustration. The agreement's executed, he said. Why are the pumps still off? I looked him straight in the eye. Because a signature doesn't rebuild a greenhouse. For the next 2 weeks, Cedar Ridge paid for truckloads of emergency water while crews worked from sunrise until dark constructing a new greenhouse exactly where the old one had stood. This time the frame was heavier steel, the glass was impact-resistant, the irrigation system was completely modernized, and the growing space was nearly double what Emily and I had built all those years before. On the day construction finished, I walked inside before anyone else. The smell of fresh lumber mixed with damp soil brought back memories I wasn't expecting. I carried Emily's old wooden stool from the barn, brushed off a thin layer of dust, and placed it beside the new seed table in the exact same spot where it had always been. For the first time since everything happened, the building felt alive again. The next morning, just after sunrise, I unlocked the pump station one more time. I slowly opened the master valve, listened as pressure climbed through the gauges, and smiled when the old pipes began humming with steady water again. Within hours, the fountains came back to life. The ponds slowly filled. Fresh water spread across lawns that had nearly given up. Life returned to Cedar Ridge, but it returned on very different terms than before. Every month since then, a payment arrives right on schedule for water infrastructure management. Nobody from the HOA has ever questioned another fence line, another greenhouse, or another inch of my property. In fact, the new board president introduced himself a few months later with a homemade apple pie instead of a complaint letter, and I have to admit, that was a nice change. Looking back now, I don't think the biggest mistake they made was destroying a greenhouse. Their biggest mistake was assuming a farmer wouldn't understand contracts, property law, or the value of patience. Out here, we spend our lives solving problems that can't be rushed. Crops grow when they're ready. Rain comes when it comes. Justice sometimes works the same way. I'd love to hear what you think. Did I go too far by leaving the water off until everything was made right? Or was it the only language the HOA was ever going to understand? Let me know down in the comments because these stories always spark strong opinions, and honestly, that's what makes the conversation interesting. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who appreciates stories where standing your ground matters just as much as getting the last word. You never know. The next HOA thought they could push around the wrong landowner might already be writing the beginning of our next story.